If you love American history, or if you love great writers with complicated lives, and if you've ever wondered how fame, failure, and family could shape one of the sharpest voices in American literature, if so, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing Mark Twain by Ron Chernow. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and on this channel, I review just about everything I read: fiction, nonfiction, fantasy, history, poetry, biography, and even the occasional great courses lecture. My goal is simple: to help you decide what's worth reading, who might enjoy it most, and what each book has to say about the world that we live in. Sometimes that means diving into the newest fantasy phenomenon, sometimes it means exploring a Pulitzer Prize winner, and sometimes it means revisiting a literary giant through a modern lens, which of course today's book falls squarely into that last category. Ron Chernow, who is one of the most acclaimed biographers of our time, has written about Hamilton, Washington, and Grant, men whose stories helped define the American nation. And so with this book, Mark Twain, he turns his attention to the man who defined its voice. This biography is a deep, richly detailed portrait of Samuel Clemens, the man behind the humor, the heartbreak, and the white suit, tracing his life from the Mississippi River to worldwide fame and eventually to personal and financial ruin. But before we get started, let's of course take a look at the author himself. Like I said, one of the most famous names in biography in contemporary America. Ron Chernow has built a career as one of America's most respected biographers, known for writing sweeping, deeply researched portraits of major historical figures. He first gained attention with The House of Morgan, which won the National Book Award, and later cemented his reputation with Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller Sr., and Alexander Hamilton, which of course famously inspired the Broadway musical Hamilton. If you've ever seen that book, it is massive, so I think many a person that is familiar with the musical is still curious to this day as to how Lin-Manuel Miranda saw that massive book as a desirable beach read that he then felt the need to turn into one of the most well-known musicals of all times. Chernow's biographies are known for their depth, their clarity, and balance. He has a rare ability to combine meticulous archival research with narrative storytelling that reads almost like a novel. His later works, such as Washington, A Life, and Grant, which I have somewhere on my shelf, both won high praise for turning monumental figures into complex, relatable human beings. With this book, Mark Twain, it's a shift from statesman and businessman to a man whose influence came not from power or wealth, but from his words. And so Chernow approaches Twain the way that he's approached his other subjects, as a man who embodied the contradictions of his time, constantly reinventing himself while reflecting on the nation's struggles and aspirations. With that, let's dig into this book, which I should say is a giant biography. So I will give you the overview of the book, which is also a biography of Mark Twain himself, and then I will give you some of the distinctions and some of the things that I found most valuable that set this book apart, and not just because of its size. But let's take a look at the book. Part one of the book is titled Afloat. It spans 12 chapters and covers about 180 or 90 pages, and it chronicles the formative half of Samuel Longhorn Clemens' life, from his chaotic boyhood in Hannibal, Missouri, through his years on the Mississippi River, to his eventual marriage to Olivia Langdon. Chernow begins by presenting an aging, disillusioned Twain trapped in a difficult time, and then he rewinds to his youth, showing how the restless, mischievous boy who grew up along the slaveholding banks of the Mississippi became the sharp, self-taught observer of American life. So through detailed scenes of his apprenticeship as a printer's devil, his time as a journeyman typesetter, and his rise to a respected riverboat pilot, Chernow portrays a young man intoxicated by freedom, language, and adventure. Yet this freedom comes at a cost: the sudden death of his beloved brother Henry, the collapse of the river commerce during the Civil War, and the moral unease of growing up in a society sustained by slavery. And as Clemens drifts westward in search of fortune in Nevada's mining camps and eventually begins to write in earnest, Chernow traces how his humor, sarcasm, and sense of tragedy take shape in those failures and those wanderings. The section closes with his courtship and marriage to Olivia Langdon, which seemed to promise redemption and respectability, but also planted the seeds of emotional strain that would shadow his later life. This section, Afloat, thus captures Twain's evolution from a rough, free-spirited boy to an ambitious young man poised to become a literary icon, while revealing the inner conflicts between rebellion and respectability, as well as guilt and laughter, that really defined him from the beginning and certainly defined much of his writing. Part two is titled Floodtide, covers 15 chapters, chapter 13 to 27, and it's about 260 pages. And it charts the height of Twain's fame and fortune alongside the personal and financial excesses that would eventually lead to his downfall. Now married to Olivia Langdon and settled among the Gilded Age elite, a term, by the way, which he himself coined, or at least popularized, Clemens becomes not only America's most beloved humorist, but also one of its most visible public figures. The author captures the intoxicating momentum of Twain's middle years, the floodtide of success that carried him into lecture halls, publishing deals, and speculative ventures that reflected both his brilliance and his recklessness. His humor becomes sharper and more self-conscious, mixing biting satire with moral reflection, as seen in works like Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and also with the sound heart and deformed conscience, that is straight from the book, which Chernow presents as the moral apex of Twain's career. Alongside this artistic triumph, Twain immerses himself in risky business schemes and technological fantasies, investing in the ill-fated page typesetting machine and rubbing shoulders with financiers who he himself once mocked. The author depicts Twain as both insider and outsider, a moralist seduced by the very capitalism that he scorned. His friendships with other luminaries, his speaking tours, and his growing political and racial awareness, including his public calls for reparations to Black Americans, show a man expanding his moral vision even as he loses financial and emotional stability. By the time that Livy's health begins to fail and Twain's investments collapse, the exuberance of his middle years gives way to bitterness and delusion. This whole section, Floodtide, captures Twain at his most dynamic and contradictory, celebrated yet insecure, wealthy but perpetually overextended, a genius both buoyed and undone by the roaring currents of the Gilded Age. Which brings us to part 3, Rapids. This one spans 16 chapters, chapter 28 to 43, and roughly 240 pages. And it chronicles the turbulent final decades of Twain's life as fame, fortune, and grief collide in a torrent of emotional and financial instability. Emerging from the wreckage of his failed investments, Twain embarks on a grueling series of world lecture tours to repay his debts, turning his charisma into both livelihood and burden. The author vividly depicts Twain as a man constantly in motion, sailing across Europe, Asia, and Africa, haunted by personal loss, yet performing the role of the beloved humorist for adoring global audiences. His wife, Livy, and their daughters accompany him through bouts of illness and displacement. Their family dynamic increasingly is defined by illness and death. The once celebrated man of letters now finds himself embittered by the hypocrisy of empire and politics. His essays such as Letters to Satan and String Times in Austria reveal a sharper moral anger than his earlier humor allowed. Chernow paints this phase as a paradoxical blend of triumph and despair. Twain achieves worldwide adulation and literary immortality even as he grows misanthropic and consumed by his financial anxiety, his self-recrimination, and his profound grief. The deaths of his daughters and wife devastate him, and his writing turns darker. For example, one of his books, a book written in blood and tears, which is lesser known, it is in tone, if not in title alone, is an example of this cynicism. Twain's, even though his wit does endure and it's as sharp as ever, it also reveals his ability to mock the absurdities of the human condition in a way that goes beyond just being a societal critic. And so, increasingly, you have doubting the goodness of humanity itself in his writings. And this section, Rapids, captures the sweeping descent of a man once held up by success, showing how Twain's restless genius and moral vision were tested, deepened, and finally defined by the losses that accompanied his later years. In part 4, it is titled Whirlpool. This encompasses 14 chapters from chapter 44 to 57. It's about 186 pages, and it chronicles the final melancholy stage of Twain's life as grief, fame, and disillusionment converge. Widowed and increasingly isolated, Clemens becomes both a national icon and a tragic figure, a man revered for his humor, yet consumed by bitterness and loss. The author portrays him as the ancient mariner of American letters, haunted by memories of family and friends that are long gone, still churning out essays and speeches and unfinished manuscripts as if writing could stave off despair. His later works, including The War Prayer and The United States of Lyncherdom, reveal a moral courage sharpened by outrage. Twain's humor now gives way to prophetic anger against violence, racism, and hypocrisy. Yet his public image remains paradoxical. He is the white-suited celebrity adored by crowds, even as he writes privately of the swindle of life. The author captures his fascination with death and spirituality, his flirtation with pseudoscience and divine healing, and his complicated relationships with much younger female admirers that he called his angel fish, whom he treated as surrogate daughters. He was somewhat financially secure but emotionally adrift by this point in his life, and so Twain spends his last years alternating between dark introspection and theatrical public appearances. These final chapters of this section trace his declining health, his retreat into solitude, and at a place at his home called Stormfield, which, by the way, I didn't talk much about this in the other sections, but he builds a beautiful home with this family that he adores, and eventually his inability to remain financially secure is actually going to cost them that home, and that's going to be one of those many things that just plagues him as he gets older. Even though he still has quite a bit of financial success, the many things that he had invested in, namely that type of printing press that never really worked, is just going to plague him, and it's going to be one of the things that really makes him all the more bitter. Of course, having his wife and his children, I should say his wife was also a fair amount younger than him, so for her to die when meant she died relatively young, and then of course he had several daughters that died young as well, and so all that is really feeding this embittered spirit of Mark Twain near the end of his life. And that is what this section is covering. And of course, you have one more section that actually covers the very final years of his life, as well as a little bit of an elegy that discusses his legacy, at least to a certain degree. Part 5, titled Shipwreck, spans 12 chapters, 58 to 69, and it is about 160 pages. And it serves as both an elegy and an unflinching psychological portrait of Twain's final years. The author depicts an aging Clemens as the man in the white clothes. Again, we've made that reference several times. It is probably the most famous image of Mark Twain, but it was also a well-known image of him at the time. And it also talks about a carefully crafted public persona that concealed his private anguish and his moral exhaustion. Though outwardly celebrated as America's elder humorist and national sage, he was haunted by the loneliness, of course, his failing health, and the ghosts of his wife and daughters. The last chapters in this book follow his fragile relationship with his surviving daughter, Clara, his brief and tragic affection for his secretary, Isabel Lyon, that consumes a fair amount of the final few chapters, and his retreat into alternating fits of bitterness and tenderness. So Twain's humor turns quite caustic, his skepticism nearly absolute, and yet flashes of warmth and humanity do still persist. And so works like Letters from the Earth reveal his willingness to challenge divine justice and human folly with unmatched candor, cementing his reputation as both a blasphemer as well as a prophet. And so the author also explores Twain's attempts to recapture domestic peace through surrogate family ties, his fascination with youthful vitality, and his wry acceptance of mortality. The section culminates in his final days at Stormfield, surrounded by a small circle of friends and admirers as Halley's Comet returns in 1910. Of course, the same celestial visitor that appeared at his birth. And so the final section of the book, Shipwreck, closes the biography with a mixture of tragedy and transcendence, portraying Twain as a man battered by fame, grief, and time, yet still fiercely engaged with life's mysteries until the very end. And that is the book of a biography, at least in my retelling of it, of Mark Twain. I, of course, could not even begin to get into all the different books for which Mark Twain is most famous for. I could not even begin to tell you the impact that they've had. Those are all worth their own books. This is just to give you a broad outline, which the author does in about 1,000 pages. I think it's just over 1,000 pages, to give you an idea of an incredible literary giant, but who was also a full person. And so despite being incredibly capable at writing, he was also someone that was plagued by all sorts of situations and things that he, in some cases, could control, but in many cases could not control, especially stuff like death and illnesses in the family. And so there's so much more in there. I find Mark Twain to be an endlessly fascinating character to study, and I certainly enjoyed this book's take at it. But let me actually discuss some of the argumentative distinctions that Ron Chernow makes in his book. When it comes to the biography of anyone, you are always going to be plagued with trying to get the right balance of telling anecdotes, sharing what they wrote, and trying to just encapsulate their personality generally. And that is something that the author is certainly trying to do here. But let's take a look at a few of the things that he is trying to essentially make the defining elements of Mark Twain's life as he is telling it. So, Ron Chernow's Mark Twain stands out not only for its depth and scale, but also for its central argument, and that is that Twain's contradictions define him. The author doesn't try to separate Samuel Clemens, the man, from Mark Twain, the public figure. Instead, he shows how they were intertwined. The same voice that wrote biting satire was also wrestling with self-doubt and grief and the changing face of America. One of the book's strongest qualities is its psychological insight. Drawing from an enormous archive of letters, journals, and family correspondence, the author presents Twain as a person who constantly battled between ambition and anxiety. Humor becomes a survival mechanism, something Twain used to make sense of personal loss as well as financial stress and the pressures of fame. That balance between comedy and tragedy gives the biography an emotional depth that goes beyond most portraits of the author. Chernow also pays close attention to the role of money and ambition in Twain's life. He shows how Twain's drive to get rich through investments and inventions reflected the same restless energy that powered his writing. Twain's lecture tours, risky business ventures, and obsession with recognition all belong to the same story. An artist trying to master the new world of fame and finance emerging in the late 19th century. In the author's view, Twain both satirized and embodied the entrepreneurial spirit of his time. Another defining feature of the book is its historical grounding. The author situates Twain's major works in their political cultural context, including not just one time period in American history. He had a long and fruitful life, so it is going to include multiple major phases in American history, including, of course, the Civil War, the Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and America's growing imperial ambitions. Twain's shifting attitudes toward race, his shifting attitudes towards religion and power are central to the story, showing how his writing evolved from lighthearted regional humor to pointed social criticism. By the final chapters, the author presents Twain as a deeply modern figure. His self-awareness, his fascination with fame, and his struggle to balance authenticity with performance feel strikingly contemporary. The result is a biography that argues that Twain wasn't merely a voice of his era. He helped invent the modern American identity, one marked by ambition, but also contradiction and frequent reinvention. I really enjoyed this book. I think that the author is a gifted storyteller. And by the author, I mean Ron Chernow. I don't mean Mark Twain. I do think he's obviously a gifted storyteller as well, but I do really think that Ron Chernow has an ability to really tell someone's life. I know if you've ever read any of his books, you look at them and you say, that is really long. But I think he does an excellent job at keeping you engaged. And I actually think that he does an excellent job at choosing the most important things to tell in a biography. I think when you see a 1,000-page biography, you think to yourself, I this must have everything that was ever written by this individual. But if you have ever tried to do any biographical work, you will quickly discover, no, there is tons and tons more that you could tell about almost anyone, especially someone as well known and as not just accomplished as Mark Twain, but someone that left such a wide variety of letters and articles and the books themselves that he wrote. All of these are going to make it so that there's so much more that you could have shared. And I do think that the author did an excellent job at choosing the most important stuff to get across the broad points that he was trying to make about a very accomplished but also a very complicated individual. That said, I did find the final portion of the book just lingered a little too long on a few things that I understood the point of them, but I think that there's just maybe a little too much detail for my interest. So for example, Twain's platonic relationships with younger girls, this got a significant portion of the book, and I got the point. I didn't need him to keep going back to it and keep going back to it, but I understood what he was trying to say. And I do think that those connections are undeniably part of who Mark Twain was. And they did indeed, could be odd and uncomfortable to read about. Even in the time, they seemed a little odd, and definitely now they seem even odder. But I would say that his extensive focus on them felt maybe a little disproportionate compared to maybe some of the other aspects of Twain's late life and legacy. It wasn't really enough to diminish my overall enjoyment of the biography, but it did stand out as a place where the narrative became maybe a little too repetitive or maybe a little too forceful in trying to make this certain point. I certainly think that the author's strengths far outweigh any of the criticisms that I have about that. His command of detail, his empathy, and his ability to capture a full human life, its triumphs, failures, contradictions, and mysteries really make this book a remarkable achievement. Mark Twain is a thoughtful, comprehensive, and deeply engaging portrait of an American icon, and I'm glad that I really got to spend a great deal of time getting to know him. He is someone that I've always been impressed and fascinated by, and this book, it does certainly add some context to that. And I would also say that I still very much am quite in awe at everything that Mark Twain did, and am very grateful for the literary legacy that he has left us. So who is this book for? Well, it's perfect for readers who love big, immersive biographies that don't shy away from complexity. If you enjoy learning about iconic American figures in all their brilliance and flaws, this is absolutely for you. fans of the other works by Ron Chernow, such as Alexander Hamilton, Grant, Washington, they'll feel right at home with the level of detail, the narrative sweep, and the psychological depth that he brings to Twain's life. On that same note, I'd probably include stuff by David McCullough. He doesn't go quite into as much detail. Matter of fact, depending on his book, sometimes he's a little more focused on a time and place and not an entire biography. In some cases, he isn't. He is focused on an entire biography, such as with his biography on Truman. I would say that these are excellent examples of biographies that I think do a great job at balancing getting to know an individual. I would say that it's also well suited for anyone who's interested in the Gilded Age or 19th century American literature or the cultural and political world that helped shape Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, of course, Twain's two most famous works that have absolutely played a role in shaping not just American literary history, but America as a whole, I would say. And if you're the kind of reader who appreciates a biography that feels like both a serious piece of scholarship and also a great story, I think that the author delivers that blend beautifully. This is also a great fit for readers who enjoy seeing the human being behind the legend, someone who struggles with doubts and someone that fails and someone that keeps reinventing themselves. Finally, it's an excellent choice for book clubs or readers who enjoy slow, steady, richly detailed nonfiction that rewards patience with real insight. So who is this not for? Well, this is not the right book for readers looking for a quick, breezy overview of Mark Twain's life. If you want that, just go to Wikipedia. Chernow writes long, deeply researched biographies, and this is no exception. It is nearly 1,000 pages of rich detail, emotional nuance, and historical context. If you prefer concise biographies that focus only on major events, this will likely feel overwhelming. It's also not ideal for readers who dislike lingering on the more complicated or uncomfortable aspects of a historical figure's life. The author doesn't shy away from Twain's failings of finance or his grief or his strange late life friendships, and those sections can be heavy. If you want a simple celebratory portrait of Twain as a lovable American humorist, this book may feel too serious or too probing. And if you're not interested in 19th century America or the Gilded Age or publishing history or the social and political context of Twain's work, then the level background that the author includes might also feel like it is just too much. In short, if you're looking for something short, light, or purely inspirational, this is probably not the biography for you. Ron Chernow's Mark Twain is a remarkable achievement at over 1,000 pages, offering a sweeping, intimate, and deeply human portrait of one of America's greatest writers. It's long, dense, and unavoidably heavy at times, but that depth is also what makes it rewarding. Chernow brings Twain to life not as a marble monument, but as a complicated, vulnerable, brilliant, and often self-sabotaging person whose humor was forged from hardship and whose insight grew out of contradiction. I came away with a renewed appreciation not just for Twain's literary legacy, but for the emotional and historical forces that shaped him, his successes that lifted him up, his losses that devastated him, and ambitions that defined him. While I had a few quibbles about the book's emphasis near the end, they didn't diminish my overall admiration for Chernow's work. If you're willing to spend the time, this biography offers a rich, thoughtful journey through a life that helped to shape American literature. It's a fitting tribute to Twain and a testament to Chernow's talent as a biographer. Of course, I'd love to know what you guys are thinking about this book, or if you've read other books about Mark Twain that you would like to share, please let me know what you are thinking in the comments. And while you're here, please go find some other videos of mine, some other reviews. I review widely. Find something else that interests you, whether it is other biographies, whether it is fantasy, whether it is young adult novels, whatever you want, please find something that interests you and become more familiar with what exactly I like to review and give me your feedback. And if you're enjoying what you are watching, please share it. The more people that know about my channel, the more videos I can make. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. And until next time, keep those pages turning.